Today I'm talking to Aaron Benanav about his two-part intervention in the New Left Review, Beyond Capitalism, which asks a deceptively simple question. What would it actually mean to organise a modern economy around multiple social goals, rather than just profit and efficiency alone? Aaron offers both a diagnosis of why capitalism appears increasingly unable to meet social, ecological and democratic needs, and a concrete institutional framework for thinking beyond it. One centred on multi-criterial decision-making, democratic investment and new forms of economic coordination. Today's video essay explores what it would take to move from critique to construction, and what a serious post-capitalist horizon might look like under conditions of uncertainty, conflict and constraint. Many people sense that today's economic system is no longer delivering either prosperity or stability, yet beyond capitalism often sounds abstract or utopian. What do you think most clearly signals that we've entered a period where thinking seriously about a post-capitalist economic order is no longer optional, but necessary?
On the one hand, you could point to the crises of our times, right? And I think that these are multiple. There's many things that are leading us in this moment to think about what could be after capitalism. One thing is just the intensification of the climate crisis and the fact that nothing about the system we have today seems to be going anywhere towards solving it. It's certainly also important, I think, the positive example China is giving, where there's a lot more state intervention, and they seem to be pushing further in the direction of a green transition than anywhere else. But it's not just the climate crisis. There's also a long-standing issue of economic stagnation, much worse in Europe and the UK than elsewhere, but also a really large global problem that cuts across countries with many different income levels. There's major problems of loneliness, of disengagement at work, of a general loss of meaning. All of these things seem to be tearing at the current liberal order and producing all of these illiberal, right-wing, sometimes also authoritarian alternatives. And so I think that as the center is giving way and you have all these right-wing options, which aren't real options at all, most of them are nostalgic, incoherent callbacks to, racist and nativist worlds that most of us hopefully don't really want to inhabit. And so I think that in that environment, obviously, another feature of the situation has been the rise of the left over the last, let's say, 15 or so years. There's been this immense amount of social struggle and social movements, the birth and sometimes also the death of new parties on the left, all of them trying to figure out between the movements and the parties what could possibly be a way forward today. And I think that one thing that I found disappointing about the rise of all of these social movements and parties, they didn't really produce any new conception of what could come after capitalism. The right has all of these horrendous nativist, revanchist fantasies. The center has now increasingly turned to these fully automated, accelerationist, AI God type fantasies. And the left, I think, doesn't really have much to offer in terms of a way forward. I think there's a general recognition that the green transition, or what was briefly called the Green New Deal, will provide the framework of some kind of transition to a better world, but not a really clear and systematic sense of what that would be. Many people are trying to figure out what this systemic alternative might look like that's adequate to our times, adequate to the kinds of beliefs and dreams that people have today, adequate to the ecological limits that our situation has made clearer, and also adequate to the technological possibilities that computers and the internet and even things like generative AI seem to make possible. So I think in spite of the darkness of the moment, I'm not alone in being hopeful and in thinking that, maybe you can get there even without hope. It's more a matter of feeling this pressing need, right, to start to articulate what it is that we offer as an alternative. I think one other thing I would mention is just that the example of China plays a really big role here. I think that as people are becoming really more and more dissatisfied with the liberal market society and with neoliberalism, this idea that if the state just steps back, markets will take care of everything and generate all the growth we need. There's obviously a kind of European or German social market economy variant of that, where the market left to its own devices is going to generate all of this income growth that we can then spend on all of our social services. So as that engine of growth is breaking down and as the unending crisis of the welfare state and of society more generally, I think people are looking to China and saying, wow, here's a society that's continuing to build things and seems to be moving forward in many respects, especially on the green transition, but is doing so through the state, not through the market. And I think that for all of the different groups in society, it really presents it presents different hopes and dangers, right? Like, I think that for a lot of people, the hope and the danger comes from the fact that China is engaging in much more state planning, but it's doing it in a really authoritarian and technocratic way. And so the question for us is there a way to do some of the things that they're doing, but to do them in a much more democratic way? What other kinds of big changes in the economy would be necessary to build towards a dynamic green transitional left alternative that is at the same time democratic? So I think those are the different features of the moment that are really pressing us towards figuring out what's beyond capitalism.
You build your model for a post-capitalist system on the shoulders of those who've tried to think through what a planned or democratically defined society might look like. Can you sketch what you've drawn from previous thinkers in this area and what you think the limitations of their approaches have been?
When we think about planning, we need to go back to the socialist calculation debate of the 1920s and 30s. In that era, there was one thinker in particular whose work I draw on a lot, Otto Neurath. He was a Viennese polymath. He worked in philosophy and economics and history, as well as in graphic design. And his big intervention was to say that maybe we could build an economy that isn't just so gung-ho on expansion and on raising people's incomes, but also deals with this whole range of other things that matter to people's lives. In a lot of ways, he worked on the ancient economy and ancient thought, and maybe Aristotle was an influence for him there. But it's like, what does a good life require? It doesn't just require having a lot of stuff. It requires all of these other things like entertainment and human connection and social inclusion and good work. And so he was interested in thinking about a society that could combine all those things. And he imagined that a planned economy could do that. One thing that's really interesting about his idea is that he didn't think we would all agree about the right way to balance and combine all of these different things that matter to us and that shape a good society and make possible good lives. He thought there would be persistent disagreement about those things. And so he imagined democratic mechanisms where there wouldn't just be one plan presented to people, but multiple plans that they could choose from that would kind of point towards different possible futures. And he thought about democratic mechanisms that would allow for that selection. This was the original idea that sparked this whole socialist calculation debate, because this Austrian thinker associated with Austrian economics, which a lot of people associate with neoliberalism, Ludwig von Mises, he argued that in order to be economically rational, we have to have this single measure of economic value. We have to be able to price and weigh all of our alternatives on one scale. And he thought that the kind of world that Neurath was suggesting, where there were multiple values in play, would make that kind of economic calculation impossible. And he used that to argue that socialism is impossible, that there's no way to build the kinds of society that socialists want to see, and that the only option is to maintain capitalism, because capitalism has markets and has a price system, and profit seeking among capitalists makes those prices real and usable. And that would be the only basis for a complex economy like what we have. And so that started this whole debate. And the thing about the debate was that most of the socialists who responded to Mises accepted that basic framework of critique that he had. They ignored what Neurath said socialism had to be, and they tried to argue that planning could just be more rational than the market in delivering efficiency gains, in delivering all of these rational economic outcomes, which they associated with efficiency and growth. Yeah, that whole debate carried on in the 20s and 30s. The advent of the Soviet Union obviously changed that whole game. The development of the 5-year plans under Stalin were this incredible transitional moment, not just for thinking about what's after capitalism, but for capitalism itself. Those ideas about long run planning had huge effects on the way the war economies were structured during World War II, on the East Asian miracle economies like Japan and South Korea, and then later also China. So, this whole way of thinking dynamically about planning seemed to present all these further possibilities that we, thinking about this today, really need to draw from. Of course, a big counterpoint to that is that Stalinism was a moral, ethical, and political disaster. This was this highly authoritarian society that suppressed and killed so many internal opponents. It destroyed democracy. That was true of a lot of the high growth societies that followed. They had different forms of maybe kind of authoritarian democracy in many cases. But something we really need to learn a lot from were also the failures in the Soviet Union and in Eastern Bloc countries. They tried to build a wholly planned economy, and that economy grew very quickly, especially during the Great Depression. It was like a miracle that the Soviet Union could grow so fast when the rest of the world was in a major depression. But eventually, the structure of planning in the Soviet Union caused all of these problems, and the Soviet economy and the Eastern Bloc economy started to stagnate. And there was a real recognition that planning itself, especially trying to plan every detail of the economy down to the lowest level of what each factory and firm did, was becoming a problem. And even within the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc countries, there was a kind of recognition that you probably needed markets to do some of that work on the ground of allocating resources. And so in Hungary and in other countries, there were these experiments with markets. It's also important to remember that the Soviet Union and all these Eastern Bloc countries, they never actually successfully got rid of markets. There were all these black markets, and they weren't just places where people were cheating. There was a widespread recognition that those markets were necessary in order for producers to be able to produce what they needed to produce. And so there was this effort in Hungary and elsewhere to legalize those markets and bring markets back into planning. And they were partially successful. In many ways, they didn't work. But I think that had a big influence on what happened in China, for example, when they decided to partially marketize their societies. But all of this created this big hole in the planning debates because after Neurath, there was this general acceptance of like the debate is, do we want planning or markets? And as the 20th century unfolded, you could say early in the century, there was a sense, well, planning really could be more rational. And by the end of the century, there was this real sense of a need for markets that left an open question about, well, what is the alternative to capitalism if that society can't just be a planned society and needs markets? I should also say that as the Soviet Union was dissolving, there was a renewed socialist calculation debate in some ways. The descendants of Ludwig von Mises and his most important student, Friedrich von Hayek, that whole Austrian school declared victory and said, look, we won. There really is no possibility of socialism. There were all these efforts of figures like Paul Kochschad and Alan Cottrell to respond to that and say, actually, now we could do planning the way Stalin intended, but with computers and a little bit of more democracy based on a lottery system. There were efforts to build alternative quasi-market structures. The most famous example is associated with Robin Hanel and Michael Albert, the Paracon proposal. And then there was a proposal for what they called a participatory planning apparatus or a negotiated coordination system through the work of Pat Devine and later his work with Fikret Adaman. That's actually the one I draw on the most. And, a smattering of other figures, all of whom trying to propose as the Soviet Union was falling apart, well, especially during perestroika, when it seemed like it might have a way forward, to figure out what that way would be. And a lot of that debate kind of flowered really big between, say, 1985 and 1995. And then in the aftermath of the death of the Soviet Union and the fall of the Berlin Wall, it sort of dissipated. And our job today is to revive, as it were, the third instantiation of the socialist calculation debate and to build a new articulation of what could come after capitalism. And especially, in my view, that will be one that learns the lessons from all these past battles. We need to return to Otto Neurath's conception of the future beyond capitalism as one in which we're trying to draw in and bring in all of these different value dimensions, all of these ethical and political values. We need to bring them in so they shape our economy, what and how we produce in a fundamental way. There's no single best way to do that. There's going to be many ways to do it. And we're going to have to use democratic mechanisms to select among these possible futures that our way of acting and our economy reveal to us. And then the second lesson we have to learn is somehow to figure out how to bring in markets and allow for this decentralized coordination of a lot of our activity to take place without at the same time giving in to the idea of profit and profitability structuring the system. We want something more like a planned investment system that's not going to put profit in the driver's seat and therefore isn't going to make efficiency our most important value, but is actually going to allow us to balance our values and select among possible futures in the way that Neurath wanted, but using a very different selection mechanism or different mechanism of getting our options to appear than what Neurath imagined.
You argue that organizing society around a single metric, whether profit, growth, or output, inevitably produces distortion and harm. What mechanisms prevent a multidimensional economy from simply reproducing new hierarchies of values or technocratic dominance under a different name?
I definitely believe very strongly that there's no single measure or goal that can encapsulate all of the goals and needs and desires and beliefs and wants about a good life that people have. I think that there's a lot of magical thinking behind a certain type of economic intuition, which isn't totally wrong. The basic idea is they say, look, no matter what you want to do, whether that's have a more ecologically sustainable society or you want to have better quality work, there's nothing you can want to do that you can't do better with more resources, right? Like ultimately, how much of all the different things we want to do we can do depends on how much we have. And then they say, so as a society, the most neutral goal that we could have is just growth, is just expanding our base of resources, because that's the foundation for everything else we want to do. The problem is that there's a lot of magical thinking in that view because it says that correctly, hey, the more we have, the more we can do. But then it somehow says, and the more we have, the more we will do, right? That there's a missing piece of the story, which is how do we go from getting more resources to actually doing more stuff? If our system is so foundationally based on the idea of putting efficiency first and growth first, there's never going to be a moment at which, a real decision is reached about how to use all the resources we have to actually do all of the things that we need to do. And one way that economists try to solve this or kind of deal with this magical thinking problem is to say that there's no contradiction, for example, between having better quality work and having more growth, or there's no contradiction between being ecologically sustainable and having more growth. And I think that that is just logically a bad approach. It is true that in many cases our goals are compatible. But if we really push to the limits and we want to get to where we maximize all of these different goals that we have, we will inevitably hit trade-off points where there's some level of growth that we have to give up in order to have more ecological sustainability or work quality or social inclusion and so on. And the problem with our current society is that it doesn't allow people to make those kinds of trade-offs. It doesn't surface these different trade-offs we could make across all the things we can do with our resources. It doesn't give them a way to do that. Now, there's nothing about recognizing that as human beings and as individuals and as a society, we have multiple goals. There's nothing that says that we need to decide among those goals in a democratic way. It's completely possible to imagine multi-dimensional economies that are run in an authoritarian or bureaucratic way. I don't want to give a false impression that the kind of system that I'm trying to describe necessarily must be democratic. I value democracy in itself. I think we should fight for a democratic version of a multi-dimensional economy. But I don't want to make a further indefensible claim that you couldn't do it a different way. We see examples of that even in China and many places today I think there are efforts to build more multidimensionality into the economy through public investment, but in ways that don't allow for democratic decision making. I think the real limit to that, which we see, and there's this great book called Breakneck by Dan Wang that explains some of these issues in China, which I think are very interesting. The issue is that there's no way for the technical experts to choose in a neutral and rational way how to balance the different goals that society has. That is to say, that they can't hide behind some defense of what they're doing as technically rational. And I think that that can cause real problems for legitimacy because people who don't have a say in what happens can just as rationally argue for a different way of organizing those priorities. And so it's really a question of legitimacy and stability if we want a multidimensional society to really reflect the balance of values that exist in society, which isn't the balance that any one individual has, right? It's something that has to be produced out of social debate and politics. So if we want something that really corresponds to what people want, then it has to be democratic. But there's also a kind of legitimacy issue, which is that there's constantly going to open up these gaps between what we actually do and what we want as what we want evolves, as our values evolve ethically, politically, and so on. And in order for the system to both be dynamic with respect to people's values and also legitimate as those values change and as those values create all these differences and disagreements in society, we need democratic mechanisms that give legitimacy to what we're doing. To think about why we need the system to be democratic, it's really good to think about why democracy matters here. Leif Wenner and I were having a debate in front of the Pantheon in Rome about this question, and he really convinced me of something, which is that on the left, sometimes we don't investigate enough what makes our institutions legitimate, right? We almost say like an institution is legitimate if it's not overthrown. We have like a revolt-based theory of legitimacy, but that's not adequate. Like what we really need to understand is that what makes our democratic institutions legitimate is that when people have disagreements, those institutions are structured in a way that brings people back together. So, we need a system. If the system is going to produce all this disagreement about what the right way is to organize society and how to balance our values, we need a system that is institutionally structured in such a way that the people who lose those debates still feel like the results are legitimate, right? That they think that we've arrived at them in a way that's fair and that they think that their voices were heard, even if they weren't decisive, and that they'll have a chance to convince society to do something different in the next round.